Welcome back, everyone, to the second episode of the Unclassified Podcast, here with Preston Stewart and Ben Wheeler. We are discussing a wide variety of things, such as the ever-escalating war in Europe today, as well as Syria, what is going on in Syria, some Lawrence of Arabia stuff happening there, and, of course, we'll also be talking about the British troops being deployed to U.S. air bases to find out who is flying these drones over the bases. But, Preston, what's crack-a-lackin', my dude?
Yeah, I mean, so Ben and I talked yesterday about maybe having to do this more than once a week because there's like major issues that came up Friday through Monday that we're not even going to get to today.
No.
So we'll see. No promises there, but it's on the docket.
The world doesn't stop.
Yeah, which is crazy. Ben, first, I think the important thing to address here is the Bears at the end of the game yesterday. What was that?
I think Eberflus is taking bets. And he's putting bets on our opponents to win, because I have never seen anyone mismanage a team so horribly. It is awful. Okay.
Did you see the press conference where he said, "I'm happy with our decision making"?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna January 6th Hallis Hall. Okay, I cannot do this. Okay, I am so over it. So. It is time for an insurrection in Chicago. We need to get rid of Matt Eberflus and maybe the whole family. I don't know. But I think he'll be fired. I think by the time this airs Monday, well, no, this is going up today, Friday. Yeah. But I think by Monday, I bet he's fired.
I'm just pumped you made it into episode 2 before you started talking insurrection in any way, shape, or form.
I just meant it as a joke. I didn't mean like actually, So, yeah, all right. Well, so. How was your Thanksgiving? That was a thing that happened as well yesterday.
Yeah, it was good, man. We just did it here. Had my wife's family over. I don't really like turkey all that much, but they bought a great big turkey, so we cooked it. Sous vide the breasts and smoked the thighs and wings.
Wow. Are you a big smoker? Like, smoke things in the...
I like to, but I'm not very good at it. I think I'm going to downgrade to a pellet one because I use one it's an offset with wood, and it takes the entire day. Like, I can't look away from the thing because I haven't figured it out well. Operator error.
Yeah. But my dad has it, and he also has to watch it all the time. He's got to put pellets and wood in it, and...
Yeah, I don't know.
We'll see. When you're focused, it's pretty good, but when you're not focused, it's awful.
It was also cold outside yesterday, so I had to go that's the thing. And the whole time trying to figure out what's up with the Syrian opposition advancing on Aleppo.
Yeah, so tell the crew here what's happening. As far as I remember, this Civil War is so old that when it first happened, I was in high school, and now I'm 27 years old. So this is a very long war, and it seems like it's back in a brand new way. So what's happening here?
Yeah, it's so complicated. I don't think it's worth our time to go all the way back to the beginning, because it strangely doesn't make it any easier. It just makes it more complicated. So what we're looking at in the last couple days is HTS, which I had to write down the name because there's so many of these different organizations flying around here. HTS stands for, that's the thing, is they just refer to them all the time as HTS. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham.
What does that mean in English?
I don't know.
Just a name?
HTS.
All right, HTS.
So anyways,
got it.
HTS kicked off this offensive in the western part of Syria towards Aleppo. And there's a couple different reasons that this is being argued that it happened right now. Aleppo is important, strategically significant, a couple key intersections right there. This is also an area where there was a ceasefire a couple of years ago, back in 2019, that the opposition forces have said that Russia and Syria have regularly violated and continue to push further into territory. There's a debate that Assad forces were thinking about another offensive, so this was done to counter it. However, this part of Syria is where you have the Russian, Iranian, and Hezbollah influence. Eastern Syria is where you have the U.S. influence. Northern Syria is Turkish influence. So, are Iran, Russia, and Hezbollah maybe occupied with something else right now?
So these aren't our guys? Wow,
no,
okay.
We don't. In fact, HTS, so, all right, yep, good lead in. We have killed HTS fighters before. you'll see them referred to as associated with Al-Qaeda or formerly Al-Qaeda. The 60-second overview there is HTS comes from Jabhat al-Nusra. Jabhat al-Nusra was initially formed as the Al-Qaeda branch in Syria. Back when Baghdadi was gaining power with Islamic State, he said, cool, you guys are now part of us. And they said, no, and actually fought Islamic State for a while. There were active Al-Qaeda Islamic State battles in Syria. Zawahiri intervened and said they are not a part of Islamic State, and they kind of kept their independence from ISIS. And then in 2017, Jabhat al-Nusra rebranded and kind of broke apart to form HTS. And at the time said, we are no longer affiliated with Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has actually been upset about this and come out publicly saying it's not good. They're still a designated terrorist organization by the United States. We have still killed HTS elements since 2017, sometimes alongside Al-Qaeda militants. The U.S. allegation is that they're still maintaining covert ties. They are Salafi jihadi, so very similar to Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, just a little different nuance in how they go about things. They're much more nationalist, so they're terroristy. So from a U.S. interest perspective, is it help us for Assad to stay in power, or does it help to put these guys in? Or not put these guys in, but like, who are we rooting for here? Yeah,
if
so
we can root for anyone.
In the process of a video right now for YouTube talking about this, and I lead with, it's okay to not have a strong opinion on this. It is very much, because you're having to choose. So this is their roots are in Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda's bad.
Right.
We don't want any Salafi jihadi groups taking power anywhere. That said, they are degrading Russian, Iranian, Hezbollah, and Syrian influence. So that's a good thing. But is it a good thing when it's this group doing it? So I think there's a reason you haven't seen strong U.S. statements at this point. It's really
What
messy.
do you think about the allegations of Ukrainian influence? That they're using
I think that's
first-person view drones? Yeah?
Yeah, but you and I have not been trained by Ukrainians, and we haven't been to Ukraine to fly those, or I haven't flown those drones in Ukraine, right?
I have.
And exactly, that's why I switched over to say I haven't.
Yeah, no, I was playing.
Everybody can watch these tactics playing out. The idea that they had to have been trained or directly, these are commercial equipment.
Right. Okay, that is a good point. So perhaps they are 80. I mean, it doesn't matter, though. I mean, so what's the Russia... we know that Ukraine and Russia are fighting in Africa, and now they're fighting... We've known for a bit that Ukraine has conducted special forces operations in Syria. What is happening there? I know the Russian armed forces kind of protect Assad from his own people. What is the situation there? Of course, Russian special forces, I read, were forced to reallocate.
Maybe got killed, yeah.
Wow. So
maybe
how does this... So from a grand battlefield perspective, if you're Ukraine, you're assisting in some way for these rebels, how does this help you in your fight against Russia as a whole? Is it just that it further logistical cost on the Russian forces in Syria?
Yeah, from a very cold perspective, I think it's the same thing as, when the Tuareg rebels killed the Wagner fighters in Mali. Like, great, it hurts Russia a little bit. And anything that hurts Russia is good for Ukraine because they're fighting for their existence. To the point where the music hall terrorist attack carried out by Islamic State, like, in a sense, that was good for Ukraine. And I know they're not going to come out and say it, but like the fact that it takes Russian resources and takes Russian focus, like, Ukraine is in an all-out fight, so anything that takes any Russian attention or resources is positive for them. That said, this is one of those things where, like, this group hates Assad, they hate Putin, they hate Russia, they hate Iran, they hate Hezbollah. They don't need, like, a push from Ukraine to do this.
Right.
They hate all those groups. Yeah.
Right. So then ultimately they've been on ice for 9 years. What do you think thawed them out? What do you think's been the ignition key here to push? Because I saw they just captured Aleppo University.
Yeah. It's interesting. I need to do a lot more digging to figure it out. I actually last week was on the verge of putting together a Syria update video, and it just fell on the back burner. And now I'm kind of glad I didn't, because it would have immediately been a pointless video. But I need to dig into it further to understand. Like, I can understand the timing why, where a lot of the Assad backers in that part of the country are a little preoccupied. But how they got to this level of capability, and clearly they didn't plan this thing overnight, right? They've been stockpiling resources, and that's something I need to dig more into.
Alrighty. Well, then I look forward to the update on Tuesday or Friday, and but do we want to go a little bit north across the Black Sea there?
Yeah, I want to. Actually, you know what? Let's wrap it up with the Hezbollah ceasefire.
Okay,
I think we'll shift out of the Middle East. Yeah, so this is something else that I was following pretty closely this week. There was a ceasefire reached in Lebanon between Israel and Lebanon. Hezbollah, remember, Hezbollah is not a government organization. And they're a political party, but they're not like the military of Lebanon. The ceasefire was agreed to after 14 months of fighting, and by and large, it'll be going back to the UN Resolution 1701, which forces essentially a buffer zone, a demilitarized zone of sorts, in southern Lebanon along their border with Israel. So what it forces is there can be no armed entities other than the Lebanese military between the Litani River and the border of Israel. It's like 30 to 40 kilometers in certain portions. Can't be Israel. Can't be any non-state actors. So that's what they're moving towards. Over the course of the next 60 days, the Lebanese army has already started to move in. Israel will move out, and this ceasefire is supposed to be monitored not just by UNIFIL, the UN organization there, and Lebanon and Israel, but also the United States and France. There's been a lot of talk about violations already. I don't think that's accurate. There's been a lot of false alarms of drones being launched into Israel that turned out to just be false alarms. And then Israel has conducted a couple strikes into Lebanon when they've seen, like, that is a rocket launch location. They watch two guys walk into the rocket launch location and they strike. So but even Israel isn't like yelling about that being a major violation. They're just kind of saying we're enforcing it. So we'll see.
Do you think this is a big foreign policy victory for Emmanuel Macron and President Biden?
Yeah, this is interesting. So you're seeing it presented as, I've seen it presented both ways now, that this is a big Biden victory. He brought these people to the table. I've also seen it presented as a Trump victory because people are negotiating ahead of Trump's presidency. However, Ted Cruz came out this week, Senator Cruz came out and said that the reason this ceasefire came about was because the Biden administration threatened an arms embargo on Israel. Essentially put their feet to the fire and said, look, this is coming next. I don't know if that's accurate. I haven't seen the other than, I don't know, what do you call when one senator releases a statement? Like, you can't write that off entirely, but I guess I haven't seen, I don't know, anything beyond that. But
it seems weird that
it's going to upset people.
It seems weird that Netanyahu would, because Joe Biden's out of office in less than 50 days. Might be less than 40 at this point. And no, it's definitely not less than 40. But it's definitely less than 50. And he can just... Trump can just reverse, and he will reverse, an arms embargo. So it's interesting that Netanyahu capitulate if that's the case. But I do think Israel perhaps did want a ceasefire.
You also have to keep in the back of mind, and this plays into some of the conversation that I think we'll have around Ukraine, but there's mixed reporting on this as well of, are these, because these are big moves, are these being done, some will say that they're being done despite Trump, like in spite of him, without his awareness, but others are saying there's actually conversation going on there, and that these are either Trump pushing for to a degree, or at the very least aware of and like approved of. I think at this point it has to be speculation in every direction, but just something to keep in mind.
Is it normal for the former president to get a say in what's happening during the lame duck period? Not the former president, the president-elect to
Incoming.
get a say over things in the lame duck period?
I don't know. My gut tells me that any major decision that would have an immediate impact would be discussed.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that means Trump has a veto over the decision at this point, or
Right.
I feel like I feel like that's worth keeping back in mind. It is possible that this was not entirely one party making a decision, or leaving the incoming president in the dark. And an argument for that is you could look at this ceasefire as it frees Israel up to focus on Iran.
Right. And do you think something's coming with Iran?
I don't know. More likely under a Trump administration, I think. And when I say something coming with Iran, I'm talking about Israel, not U.S. direct military action. But there are some hardliners in Israel that are still, and they're not wrong to say the issue here is not Hamas. Those are symptoms of the larger problem that
Right.
is the Iranian regime. They're correct there. And in each round of military escalation where Israel has gone into and conducted strikes in Iran, there have been people in Israel that have said, not enough. We need to go
Yeah.
further. So that push is there. I'd be hesitant to say it's likely, but I would say it's more likely under Trump than it has been under Biden, and more likely now that Hezbollah has been resolved than prior.
So, I mean, you keep up to date on the acquisitions of the Israeli military, right?
Not in the
So
least.
here's my question
What
for
do
you.
you got?
I read in a book called Grand Delusion, The Rise and Fall of American Ambition in the Middle East. It's by a guy who used to be on the National Security Council for Bush and Obama. And what he wrote was that both Bush and Obama blocked Israel from obtaining aerial refueling vehicles that they would need, in addition to a certain bomb type, to prevent them from attacking Iran's nuclear sites on their own. Has that purchase gone through with Biden and Trump? If not, I think... Go ahead.
I think they do have aerial refueling capabilities.
I know
Because
they
think
currently
needed
have
that.
their own, but they need a special type, is my understanding. I don't know how true that is. I just know what I've read.
All right, I won't say anything definitively, but I thought that they had to conduct aerial refueling for their attacks in Yemen a few months back.
I think
Possible
you may
that the
be
United
right.
States did that with them, but
Yeah. So, well, my understanding is it's a different kind of aerial refueling. I don't know how they differ. My understanding is
I don't know,
probably
the
the
other
KC-135, right?
the other pushback I'll have there is like Israel's totally capable of building or modifying something on their own, I would think. It's not some third world country that like couldn't, you know what I mean?
No, yeah. I now that you're pointing it out, I do realize I was a fool to blindly believe this. But I was like, oh, okay. Well, I guess maybe it's hard to create aerial refueling. I don't know.
I
But
don't think so.
yeah, that makes sense. So it is a good book, though. But maybe look at it a little critically when he talks about Israeli hardware.
All right, let's move out of the Middle East because there's a ton going on with Ukraine right now, and fortunately, it does seem like the wars with Israel are dying down a little bit. They're probably going to ramp up operations in Gaza, but like, hopefully, fingers crossed, we're closer to peace, which is good timing because
Netanyahu the dove.
your words, not mine. It's good timing because we've gotten more nuclear threats in the last, like,
Yes.
I would say legitimate nuclear fear in the last week than I can remember in my lifetime.
Really? Weren't you alive for the Cuban Missile Crisis? I mean, is this worse than that? Yeah, so, no, I do agree with you. This is... I've only ever lived under U.S. hegemony. I believe you have as well, so...
When do you think I was born?
Launching the ICBM, kind of crazy, right? But then it kind of spirals. It's kind of been spiraling out of control since then. I don't want to say spiraling out of control. I think everything's perfectly under control. I think what's changed is the way the West talks about the conflict. Because I think the ICBM launch was a wake-up point, if that makes sense. Do you agree?
Yes and no. I think it was a wake-up point in the sense that it mobilized a lot of people that maybe weren't paying attention previously. Because for all of the other escalations in Ukraine, this is really the first one that I can remember where there's been any suggestion that a weapon could be used elsewhere or that you could blink and it could be nuclear. So like Russia's used a lot of weapons like calibers and what else? Toshka maybe and anyways, they've used plenty of missiles that could be nuclear capable, but we're never talking about like, oh, next one might have a nuke. That changed with this ICBM/IRBM. So I think it pulled a lot of people into the conversation that weren't there.
Right. Well, so let me ask you this before we get into this play-by-play here. In warfare, we know the history is restraint, right? Always. And that it is step-by-step escalation. Why is it when we talk about nuclear war, it's just immediate apocalypse and not a tit-for-tat situation that escalates via nuclear weapons?
That's a good point. Man, you're going to make me like sound like I'm arguing in favor of nuclear war here, which would be fun.
Well,
you can fight. A nuclear war could be fought and we could still live, right? The argument is that once that starts, we somehow can't control ourselves and it wouldn't be one nuclear detonation or two, it would turn into thousands, is kind of the argument there. So people immediately go, nuclear war means the end of mankind. But yeah, technically, that's not true, right? I mean, Russia could lob a nuke into Kyiv tomorrow.
Right.
And we wouldn't really feel the direct impact here in the United States. We do
know the U.S.
nuclear
response.
Weapons.
That is, we do know the U.S. response would be a military intervention, but also, according to Biden war games, they're nuking Minsk, apparently, in response. So that is apparently what happens here, at least according to the White House's own war games. So
Is that why Belarus last week started freaking out about a NATO invasion? Did you see that?
I did see that, and I have a feeling the books that are going to come out of this conflict are going to reveal so many like scares that we don't know of, because it seems like, especially, it happens less now, but if you remember the first 2 years, especially the first year, Ukraine and Belarus and Russia were freaking out about it, just seemingly kind of like schizophrenic, out of nowhere complaints, right? And now they're all very calm. But there were points where Ukraine was claiming Belarus is gonna invade, like you said, Belarus claiming NATO invasion happening again, all this kind of stuff. So I think you're right.
Funny.
Maybe, yeah, I think something might be happening there.
It's nerve-wracking too, because so from the NATO perspective, like we're in a NATO country, right? Like it's hard to imagine that NATO is sitting around going, you know what we should do?
Yes.
A land invasion of Belarus, like strategically, that'll reset the game. So it's hard to imagine that that's in the cards, like at all, in any way, shape, or form. But the concerning piece is Belarus state media was talking about it and saying like, we have intel, this is about to happen. And then immediately you had Russian leadership saying, like in their new nuclear doctrine, they say that they will defend Belarus in the event of an attack. Not just friendly countries, they name Belarus, and then they came out and said like, yeah, an attack on Belarus will be viewed by an alliance, will be viewed as an attack on Russia. It's like, so when you put all that together, it's like, wait a minute, guys, hey, what are you talking about?
It is interesting. I know they have the joint union where they plan to merge into one country, but I don't think this happened till Lukashenko's dead, or at least leaves office. So it is a little weird they're freaking out about it. Do you think Lukashenko and Belarus, people talk about it, do you think they'll ultimately flip to the West before the end of this conflict, or do you think they're ride or die?
I don't see any reason they would. Yeah, I don't know enough about domestic politics in Belarus, but it's, from what I've seen, it's hard to imagine a scenario where they are lockstep with Russia in a lot of ways.
That is true. But, I mean, Putin has been trying to get Lukashenko to deploy troops, to deploy all kinds of things, and
Aren't there
Lukashenko's
Russian nuclear
refused.
missiles in Belarus now? Didn't they deploy some nukes?
There may be, yeah. Yeah. But, I mean, every time he tries to get him to deploy troops, he's talking about, he needs kids to pick potatoes in the fields or something, and it's always somehow Lukashenko can't deploy Belarusian troops to Russia because it's just too much for him at the time or whatever reason. So I don't know. It's something to think about.
A question for you. I feel like a lot of this it seems like it's spiking right now. How much do you think this ties into U.S. domestic politics? Like, is the tension spiking in Ukraine just because that's what happens from time to time? Or is it related at all to kind of the timing of a new administration coming in?
So I think the Russian ICBM is unrelated to U.S. domestic politics. I think the European response we've seen with France and the UK talking about deploying troops, Poland assembling a new alliance that sounds very familiar to a coalition of the willing, I think that is all in response to U.S. domestic politics. I don't know. I tend to believe that the Europeans are sincere, that they will intervene. But I also understand that a part of it is that they are threatening to a certain extent, like, let's light the candle, right? Like, we will go in if the U.S., if President-elect Trump doesn't uphold his obligations. So I think there's also that. So I think the European response is in response to the American side of politics and the growing isolationism. But I think the Russian ICBM is not. Although you could argue that perhaps he's doing it to try to intimidate. Because if you remember, after the launch happened, and even after the U.S. signed off on long-range strikes into Russia, you had Tucker Carlson, Donald Trump Jr., screaming about World War III. I don't know, but I mean, U.S. intelligence just said that the sign-off on long-range strikes into Russia, at least in their eyes, has not raised the risk of nuclear war or raised Putin's likelihood to start a nuclear war. So, I don't know. I mean, what do you think? What's your read on it?
Okay, so I think to get into we actually have a piece. I think we'll probably wrap up with it. Save the opinions for last, but
yes.
A piece about where people get their news from online. And this will play into that a little bit. But what's interesting is you just said U.S. intelligence agencies don't assess that there's any new risk of nuclear war, but media personalities on the right say that there is. And I just want to say that, like, the people that go to my gut tells me that a lot of the rise of Trump and maybe populism, if you put it that way, is a distrust of institutions. So you just gave an institution assessment, and then the people that are pushing back against the institution, saying don't trust them, gave the opposite one. So
yeah,
I wonder if those statements kind of talk to two separate audiences in a way. You know what I mean?
I do. There is a sense, at least in past years, that we were all kind of in the same theater, watching the same movie. And it seems what happens in American society more and more is we're all in the same movie theater, but we're all watching different movies, right? So you're right. It's probably going to two different audiences, and it would not surprise me if you got a group of 10 Americans, 5 had a different understanding of the war than the other 5.
But I also think that's understandable because, so in this case, I would say, having followed this war from the beginning, I would say that this was the closest to a nuclear exchange we've been.
Really?
It was for some reason, reports came out a couple days ago where people were like, there were no explosives on the warheads. Like, I thought we knew that right away.
Right, nothing happened. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was, why is that being reported later, like some big investigative uncovering? But anyways, this type of missile, from what we can tell, appears to, it's either nuclear or nothing. There's no conventional use case for intermediate range ballistic missiles or ICBMs. So if you're using a munition that can only be used for nuclear payload delivery, to me that is into a war zone. You're firing it into enemy territory. To me, that is the closest we've come in terms of a signal saying, look what we could do. I understand there was some communication before the launch to warn the United States of what they were doing. But even then, like, it's people would have seen that launch. How many people saw the launch of that missile or tracked the launch of that missile and did not know that it was a non-nuclear payload? So to me, this was the closest that we've ever been, even if all things considered, it wasn't like on the table. So I don't think it's crazy to say that we're closer to nuclear war now than we have been in a long time, which is a concern. We should avoid that, I think, at all costs. So the fear of that is totally justified, in my opinion. But as somebody who's been following this war, we've also seen Putin threaten this shit so many times that it gets exhausting. And he's constantly shifted the red line, so it's hard to take him seriously. And I understand that probably the best take is somewhere in the middle there.
Yeah. Do you think it's the missile launch itself that was provocative? Or do you think it was the use of the MIRV warhead that brought us closer to nuclear war?
One and the same. I put those two in the same category. It was the type of missile that was launched, where it impacted.
Okay. Yeah, I think the fear is justified. I think overly focusing on the fear only feeds to Putin's desires.
Yeah, like I don't like seeing people online bash anybody who says we have to be concerned about nuclear war. They say it'll never happen, it can't happen. Like I think that is an inappropriate thing. I don't think that's the right way to go about it. You have to have that in mind.
Agreed. Do you think so? Kind of weaving our way to our first topic. Do you think that the European troops, whether the British and French together in alliance, or a Polish coalition of the willing, or Estonia taking over defense in Ukraine's western half, do you think that raises the risk of nuclear exchange, or do you think it just raises the risk of a larger war? Or to you, are they one and the same?
Oh man. The challenge is that Russia so quickly goes to the nuclear question. And just a few days ago, some of their top mill bloggers talked about how they're not in a position to take on NATO in a conventional war. And that shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. Right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That should not be a surprise to anybody. A conventional ground war with Russia is not the big issue for NATO. It's where that could lead to. I don't know, man. Honestly, it'd be hard for me to weigh in on that. If they just entered the fight and held the lines, probably not. If they started to retake territory, maybe. If they ended up in Kursk, definitely.
Well, do you think that they could communicate effectively? So let's say, in my mind, and this is my thought, if you said NATO is intervening in the war in Ukraine, my mind immediately goes to the first Gulf War, where they pushed Saddam out of Kuwait, but they did not go any further. Or maybe they entered Iraq a little bit, but my understanding is that they did not go any further, and they kind of gave up. Not gave up, but the war was over. Saddam was done. So do you anticipate it being more like that? Or do you see this being more of a 2003 invasion where the U.S. and NATO marches to Moscow?
Jesus. I think if
I know we don't want to get in the hypotheticals, but I mean we're a little bit closer, you know.
If there were NATO troops marching to Moscow, I think you would see nuclear war. I think that would be.
But if it was just U.S. NATO troops evicting them from the Donbass and Crimea, do you think that happens?
Crimea, yes.
Yes, my bad.
I don't know, man. Yeah, it's too hard to. How about this?
Well,
I don't think that's on the table.
You don't think it's on the table?
No.
All right. Well, what do you think, though? I think that if
NATO troops in Ukraine fighting against Russia, is that on the table?
I don't think under NATO command, but I think it's possible for individual European countries, yeah.
More than the International Legion. You're talking about defined units.
Yeah, I'm talking about
like an Estonian brigade.
I think if Russia starts to make serious advances towards Kyiv, I see Macron and Poland pulling the trigger. I think the only reason I am not optimistic the UK does the same is because I view the UK as being more in lockstep with the United States. But perhaps on this case, they would be more in lockstep with France. So, I mean, there's that. But I did hear a rumor online this week. NATO's going to preemptive strike Russia? What's this all about, Preston?
I was going to say, all good stories start with I heard a rumor online. This one was so frustrating, man, in so many different ways. Admiral Bauer, our buddy Admiral Bauer,
Yeah, we know.
The
We
head
love
of the
him.
NATO Military Committee, which it's worth saying he's very diplomatic, he's very articulate, and he's very measured in what he says. So this is not a guy that like you get to quote a lot of saying crazy things. It's the opposite. He was doing a Q&A and he said something like, if people always think that because we're a defensive alliance we can just shoot down missiles. But you know what? Actually, I've got it here. Let me read it. This is going to be one worth reading word for word, right?
All right.
He says, the idea that we are a defensive alliance, so we will only sit and wait until we are attacked, and when we are attacked, we will be able to shoot down the missiles that come to us. But it's smarter to not only do that, but to attack the missile launcher that is in Russia if Russia attacks us. And of course, because we are a defensive alliance, we will have to take the first blow. And so the way I read that across the board is we're not just going to shoot down the missiles that are inbound, we're going to knock out the launchers too, so Russia can't do it in the future. But because we're a defensive alliance, essentially Russia will have to take the first step. That got relayed by Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, as NATO is talking about preemptive military strikes into Russia. And holy cow, dude, it got picked up. People ran with it for about 48 hours and just refused to look at what Bauer actually said.
Yeah, it does not sound like a preemptive strike at all. He literally says we have to take the first blow.
This is what's so frustrating with this, though, is like this is the normal this is like the flow of disinformation or misinformation. And usually it's really like camouflaged. And you got to find out like it's maybe putting together different statements or all sorts of different things. This is just like, well, just look at the original quote. Like he's quoting them incorrectly. And then there were a couple Russian media outlets that changed the quote too.
That's crazy. So did NATO release a statement combating this disinformation?
Not that I saw. I get the feeling this was like
yikes.
an online battle. Yeah,
I see. Yeah,
like
fair.
maybe
well, I
it
mean,
didn't
for
matter,
Lavrov's,
big picture. Yeah,
that is true. Interesting, but interesting on the preemptive strike. The German intel chief said that, as we know, Article 5 was redefined this past summer to include currently, well, I shouldn't say currently, last year and every year before that, Article 5 used to mean one singular attack. So whether it be a Pearl Harbor, a 9/11, invading Poland, whatever. They changed it to be cumulative. One can assume to try to deter Russia more, meaning that if you cut the rail lines like Russia did in Paris during the Olympics, then that is 1 point, right? And so then when you GPS jam and a flight in Lithuania crashes or crash lands, that's point 2. And so eventually it reaches to the limit of Article 5, and the alliance declares it, like this Chinese ship, there may or may not have conducted Russian sabotage by cutting internet cords, that eventually the alliance would do that. And so the German intel chief said, well, we may have to consider eventually invoking Article 5 here. But he also said that he believes Russia will test NATO's Article 5 to prove that the alliance won't stay together, that the United States won't come to Europe's defense during Article 5. Thoughts here?
Yeah, first off, the cutting of the rail lines, I remember hearing about that in Paris. Was that confirmed that it was connected with Russia?
Ooh,
I just remember
I don't know. I remember hearing that suspected Russians were responsible. Okay. My understanding is that a lot of things happen is usually someone paid by Russia or an activist enabled by Russia to a certain extent. I don't know if the French were...
I got you.
Yeah. So, but I do know, like, the arsons in Germany and Poland and the attempted arsons, pretty transparently Russian. People paid by Russia to do it.
And I want to come back to the Chinese ship thing because I have some questions about that. I just saw the headlines on it, but I think it's normal for Russia to test the boundaries of NATO. If I were in their shoes, that's what I would be doing, and I think probably in reverse course, we're all doing it to some degree, kind of testing where is that line going to be. This is Russian gray zone operations. They're good at this. They've got a pretty robust information warfare capability, right, and cyber capability, and one of the directions I thought you were going to go there was talking about how cyber has been included in
that as well.
in NATO's Article 5, right? So it's no longer just a bomb falling on New York, but it could be a cyber attack. But to what degree? Because and this is where I think Article 5 gets confusing. And for those not aware, I think it's worth mentioning now that NATO's Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all, is not automatic. So
No.
it has to be invoked. And then for it to go into place, all 32 member states have to agree. Which I don't know that you're going to get 32 member states to agree on anything at this point. But
Wait, so do all 32 have to agree? I thought it was they invoke it and then whoever wants in is in.
no, all 32 have to agree for NATO for Article 5 to go into effect. And then if it is invoked, then if it goes into effect, then everybody has to do something. But not everybody has to fight.
God.
So it could be training bases or overflight rights or providing medical equipment. But any two countries can do anything side by side without invoking Article 5. But
Do you
just by
think-
saying,
Yeah. Do you think, though, that... Go ahead.
Well, what I was going to say is the reason that's important is it's not as though a Russian cyber attack because we've heard about it, right? Russia has conducted cyber attacks recently. Like, technically, those through NATO Article 5 could be enough to trigger a NATO response. They haven't, right? We're not in a nuclear war with Russia
Yeah.
through NATO because of a hack against some email server or something. So there is some discretion there. And I think that's worth mentioning that it's not this automatic. But when you get into some of these, it gets really complicated because, again, an email hack probably doesn't result in a NATO military strike. But what if it shut down the grid of the Eastern Corridor for a month, right? Like,
Right.
maybe at that point it does. So it's open to interpretation, I guess is the way to put it.
So you said that, you don't think all 32, 33 members would agree. Who do you see it blocking? Is it just Orban?
No, I mean, I think when you're looking at what's happening in Ukraine right now, you have to look at Hungary and Turkey as possibly not being on board.
Oh,
with
so
what's in
Erdogan
there
as well.
in this specific case. But I think a lot depends on the nature of what actually happened too, right? I mean, all of these countries have different economic interests around the world and different political interests around the world, and some are going to be up for re-election at times when others aren't, and something that might very clearly be a violation of Article 5 for half of NATO members might not be for others because they just don't want to tackle it in the middle of an election year or something. So I just think to get there would require a very, very clear, overt, damaging attack.
Interesting. So do you think that NATO is perhaps bluffing with their cumulative Article 5?
No, I think those are the right move because of that stuff, right? If you conduct one cyber attack a week for 3 years and slowly degrade some sort of infrastructure, like that's still important. No one of those items is going to raise to actually doing something about it. But I mean, I don't know. Good luck putting all of those things together and trying to convince somebody that that's justification for a war, right? I think it has to be a big event.
I think I agree with you. I don't see. You can say it's cumulative all you want, but to me, you're right. So they cut internet lines, or they light a warehouse on fire, or whatever. Why? It's cumulative. So what's the difference between this warehouse getting lit on fire versus all the other ones? Like, has it actually changed the equation? I understand fundamentally, but in terms of convincing your public,
Yeah. Go to the China thing real quick.
Yes, so China, there
that.
was a Chinese-owned ship, and its crew is suspected of deliberately dragging an anchor for 100 miles to cut Baltic Sea cables. Now, it is completely surrounded by a small NATO flotilla, with ships made up from Germany, Denmark, and Sweden, and they want to question the crew, and the crew has not agreed to questioning as of right now, and they believe it's deliberate. They're saying there's just no way you can drag your anchor this long. It cut internet lines between Sweden and Lithuania, as well as Germany and Finland. So it's kind of a big ordeal. The Danish Navy intercepted it, and they can't, under international law, they cannot tow it to port. So it's kind of just going to sit there until it either capitulates or a negotiation's met with the company that owns it. Western officials don't believe the Chinese government's behind it, but rather they believe it's Russian sabotage. There's also one Russian sailor on board. I'm not saying he's guilty, so don't come at me for the defamation lawsuit, but they believe that has something to do with it. So, have you heard about this?
So the headline, I'm going to embarrass myself real quick. It was not that long ago that I realized that undersea cables were actually a thing.
Really?
Yeah, because I knew all about them from like World War One and World War Two. Like, of course, we had those, but they just weren't like top of discussion for a long time. So when they came back into, I don't remember when it was, but when they came back into like, oh, this is a real this is a threat. These could be severed. I was like, oh, we're still doing that. We still have cables laying on the. All right.
I'm kind of surprised that they just lay there, that they're not like covered or anything.
That's what I'm saying. Like, it feels like that's the best. That's the best thing we can do. We can't even get to the bottom of the ocean in a bunch of parts, but somehow we've got these cables. I don't know. I didn't expect that. I thought maybe in this day and age it was all satellite or. So I'm learning stuff all the time.
I mean, it is kind of a goofy solution, so I don't blame you. So.
But I guess we got power lines out, so I don't know, not the same. But I
agree. I'm surprised they're not buried. I don't know. I'm surprised they just kind of hang out down there. They're not buried. Or there's
that, right? Just
so fundamentally, I understand like from the U.S. to the U.K. or U.S. to Ireland cables. Maybe it's a bit much to bury them, but like I don't know, the Baltic Sea. I mean, what is it to you guys? Just take some of that oil money and bury it. I don't know.
I feel like this is something we should have resolved. Also, doesn't that feel like a major national security issue? That like we've just got these cables that an anchor can go down and.
Well, NATO
that raises another question
it,
here.
Yeah.
So like, apparently it's not that far down because like, how far do anchors go? They're not. I'm sure it varies widely, but like, they couldn't have been that far below the surface if an anchor can grab that thing.
So. This is the first time in my entire life it's occurred to me that an anchor just doesn't touch the ocean floor. So
it can't, right? There's certain areas where it wouldn't reach that far.
I know a boat guy. We should get him on here to answer questions. But yeah, okay. So, but if it doesn't hit the ocean floor, doesn't the ship just keep moving?
Yes.
This is like the deaf leading the blind. I mean, I have no idea what the ship thing. So, okay. No, I think it has. I mean, how deep is the ocean floor? It's got to be like 100 feet. I know, like, not at its lowest point.
Where was this? It was in the Baltic?
Yeah.
No.
I'm going to find out here. 2 anchors.
1,506 meters.
Oh,
1,506 meters.
So here's what we have. No, not all anchors need to hit the bottom of the ocean. They're called, some are called drogues. All right. So obviously it's not going to hit the bottom there. So maybe they just, are the cables tight then?
Here's what I want to do. We need to come back to this because we're both talking nonsense about stuff we don't understand. And I was just saying how I didn't even know undersea cables were still a thing until uncomfortably recently. So let's move on from that one.
Yes.
It will be interesting to see though, because to your point, they can't force them to come in for questioning, but yeah, it does just line up. I actually was working on a video recently and then got sidetracked to lay out all of the different Russian sabotage operations. It is overwhelming, and the problem is so many of them are just it's just gray zone stuff, right? Like this guy's wife was from Russia, and he set a train car on fire, and like it's all sorts of little things where I'm sure there's some really clear-cut cases, but it's also a lot of random things going wrong in NATO countries all around the same time. But
what do you make of the? Do you remember earlier this year when the ammunition factory in Pennsylvania lit on fire? Do you think that has any connection? At the time, people were kind of looking around, but I was like, in the United States, I don't know about that, but I mean,
But
it's
also
entirely
an ammunition
possible.
factory, right? So like the things
Yeah.
are there, could catch on fire. I don't know. But it wasn't the only one. Wasn't there another one in Europe at the same time?
There
that
was
went up?
one in Europe, and they also caught plots to light U.S. tanks on fire as well in Germany. There was like and then they also tried to assassinate, or they plotted to assassinate the head of a German defense company as well.
Yeah.
So that is, no, it's overwhelming. They're always up to something.
It's cumulative. They're trying to get that cumulative Article 5, I think, then.
Well, so what do you think? So let me ask you this. We know that we always know what China and Russia are doing to the West because we're democracies, and the way our systems work lead to that usually eventually making its way to the public. Now, we don't know what we do to Russia and China because of the way the media, the way the system works. Do you think we are doing sabotage back
Yeah.
on the same scale?
I don't know. It'd be purely speculative. If not, I wouldn't necessarily say directly sabotage. I'm sure there's constant cyber operations in every direction. And we've probably facilitated some Ukrainian or resistant sabotage inside of Russia. I'm sure we have those contacts somewhere. There are resistance groups inside of Russia that don't like Putin. They probably have a lot of contacts around the world. So it'd be, I think it'd be silly to assume that we're not, but
I could see
also, it's only been recently that Russian shopping malls stopped catching fire every week. You remember that stretch?
I do remember that. We have a breaking news notification. Syrian armed rebels have entered Aleppo. That's crazy.
Did you know calling them rebels can piss people off?
What am I supposed to call them?
You're not supposed to talk about it, man.
Oh,
can't say
okay.
it.
So they're just Syrian guys with guns. What do you? What
Some
do I
people
call them?
with, well, depending on, I'm joking, like call them whatever you want, but I'm just saying
Okay.
This is one of those landmine things where if you call them rebels, people will say no, that means that they're like fighting for freedom, but they're actually jihadis. But some of the people they're fighting alongside are like rebels that are just wanting a better Syria. So they're rebels, but they're not rebels, and the overall organization, like, it's that kind of messy.
Wow. Well,
In Aleppo, really, that's tough. That's going to be a lot harder for, well, I don't know. Technically, it's a lot harder to identify targets in an urban setting. I'm not sure how much of a difference that makes for Assad and Putin. They haven't exactly
No.
been precise.
I mean, you remember what happened last time in Aleppo?
yeah.
They just destroyed the place.
Leveled the whole
So do you think, back to the Russian sabotage, there were the shopping malls. I've always put it up to Ukraine doing it, but you're saying that, you're opening my eyes saying that this could be the United States, could be the West, could be NATO.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that it is. I think you just have to keep that. There's some pretty robust networks, intelligence networks that
Right.
countries have. I just wouldn't write it off entirely.
Gotcha.
But
well,
Ukraine, when it comes to penetration of anything in Russia, Ukraine is kind of leading that charge in a lot of ways right now. I think 3 years ago, it would have been more likely that it was, some contacts with NATO or something. But more and more, like, you'll find random Russian military officers go for a run in Moscow and end up dead. Like, or in Crimea, they go out for a bike ride, or they go to pick up some milk at the grocery store and their car blows up. Like, Ukraine is getting pretty lethal with this stuff.
well, you have to imagine. I mean, Russia. The part of the key thing here to remember is that it's something like 90% of Ukrainians, 80% of Ukrainians can speak Russian, but only 3% of Russians can speak Ukrainian. I mean, there's just a natural advantage Ukraine has there, that Russians can't really get into their services, but Ukrainians, they all speak Russian, so I mean, that definitely helps, right? But
Has to.
we do have changing topics here. Putin threatens to use a missile which is comparable in strength to a nuclear strike, and then he called Donald Trump intelligent and said that he's still not safe in the United States, that the American people are going to try to harm him again. Thoughts?
I can't keep up with the different statements from Putin recently. So I saw one where he just said, like, we're making a lot more of these missiles. We're identifying possible targets in Ukraine, decision-making centers, kind of suggesting they might send the next one after Kyiv. My guess is they probably won't. They don't want to risk any of these being intercepted, and the Patriot is probably the best chance Ukraine has at intercepting one of these. So they're probably going to focus more in the east and the south, where there's not really an indication. I don't know where the Patriots are, but there's probably a lot of them around Kyiv. So we kind of suggest that Russia is planning another strike with this IRBM, ICBM sometime in the near future. At the same time, they did release some imagery talking about how this thing could strike multiple cities across Europe. They haven't talked about it having the range to reach the United States, which is interesting. Like, from all of the experts in Russia talking about this missile system, they kind of max out around 5,000, maybe 6,000 kilometers, which wouldn't be enough to reach the U.S., at least from their launch points in Western Russia. I guess technically they probably could in the very, very northeast, but yeah, then I saw something. So those are just all threats. But then I saw some stuff where he was kind of courting Putin, or kind of courting Trump. Can you go more into that? Because I don't think I saw that.
So when it comes to Putin and Trump, so he did praise him as intelligent. He's done it in the past. He's called him very brave, says he's so courageous. There are two aspects to remember here. So the first is that Vladimir Putin knows how he is perceived in American politics, and he knows how Trump's affinity or Trump's lack of aggression towards him is perceived. And so he plays into that a lot, right? Because he knows it sows discord in the United States. He knows that by saying, oh, Donald Trump's so intelligent, he's so brave, I can't believe the Democrats would do that to him, helps further divide the United States, right? People have already drawn their battle lines, and just people further entrench themselves. With that said, the other part of the Putin thing is that other world leaders have said that President Trump is very... If you flatter him, you can kind of get what you want. And that does seem to be the attempt here, is to also flatter him. So it's kind of a two-pronged thing that Putin's doing here, to try to create more division in the United States by using himself, while also trying to hopefully get Trump to acquiesce to what he wants. But I don't know if Trump's going to do that, though, because if you look at all of Trump's picks, the most recent one being General Kellogg, the brother of General Mills, and you didn't like that joke? Get Kellogg and Mills? Anyways, so General Kellogg is the pick to be the special envoy to Ukraine, and his whole thing is escalate to de-escalate. And now there's this new language that's arriving in the American political sphere that they may halt arms shipments to Ukraine unless they agree to peace talks with Russia. Now, my take, if you'd said this to me, I would say, I think people are misinterpreting, is what I would say, because people immediately assume that they're coming straight to the table. But what Kellogg's saying is that, like, we're just going to keep feeding arms, escalate to de-escalate with Ukraine, flood the zone, and then so long as Ukraine agrees in principle to do peace talks with Russia, then these U.S. arms shipments are going to bring Russia to the table. Maybe that's idealistic from Trump's appointees and Trump himself, but I don't think that this new talk that you're seeing of we're going to cut off arms to Ukraine unless they agree to an arms shipment is all that damaging. I think that is literally what they're doing, and I think it's removing the context, because Ukraine has already agreed to peace talks with Russia, right? So, you see my point here?
Yeah, you really have to read the tea leaves on what's going to happen with future talks here, because Trump has been very cagey with this. By and large, he sticks with, I will end the war quickly, and it wouldn't have happened if I was in office. That tends to be about as far as he'll go, right? So to try to gauge what's next, a lot of times we're looking at these people that he's appointing and looking at their past statements, which may be different when they work in a Trump administration. But, you've got Tulsi Gabbard up for D&I. I would argue that she would be more in favor of cutting off weapon shipments. although I don't know how much the DNI plays into that. Then you've got Rubio in state, who I'd say like is 60-40.
Yeah.
He seems to be against it when there's some politics at play, but when you're talking about pure geopolitics, he seems to be in support of it. Hegseth in defense, I'm still not entirely clear where he falls on Ukraine. So much of the stuff around him has been tied up in personal controversy at this point that I haven't been able to sift through to a Ukraine policy. But these other picks here, you've got Kellogg, very hawkish, and then the National Security Advisor, very hawkish, more weapons to Ukraine, and Seb Gorka, which is supposedly going to play a role in the administration, also very hawkish on more weapons. The way to achieve peace is get Ukraine in a position of strength. So that's where they're negotiating from. So you have to read the tea leaves again, which means there's a lot of room for interpretation. I'm leaning more in that direction now, a little over 50%, that Trump is probably going to maintain, if not increase in the short term, weapon shipments to force Putin to negotiate.
Do you think he can force Putin to negotiate? Because our friend Ryan Macbeth said that Putin can't negotiate. He can't come to peace because you have a collapsing economy and you have a whole new group of young men who have guns and know how to use them. And therefore it kind of spells the end for Putin. So do you think that it's possible to even bring Putin to the negotiating table?
So side note, they are having troubles with Russian soldiers coming back home, committing crimes, as you would expect, severely beaten down with versions of PTS. Like, there's a large group of Russian soldiers really, really going to battle with that for a long time. The society is going to battle with that no matter how this war ends. It's hard to say because Putin cannot at this point say, I would negotiate if. So it is in his best interest to draw a hard line and say we cannot negotiate and kind of lay out all the scenarios why victory is the only way forward for both parties, really, right? Neither is incentivized at this point to lay out like a moderate position of where they could get to. So although I will say, I feel like we're starting to see that emerge in some Ukrainian circles where they're talking less about retaking Crimea, for instance. That has not been in the conversation for a long time. Even maybe not retaking all of the lost territory in the east. So there do seem to be some concessions there, but we're not going to see concessions from Putin. I think that's the big gamble here is if you're not going to see any concessions at all, then adding more weapons into the mix just escalates this further. But if you don't know, and it's possible, adding more weapons to the mix could bring him to the table. So I think it's a gamble either way, and I think there's valid arguments in both directions. Hopefully the people making those decisions have a little more kind of behind-the-scenes insight.
Well, for what it's worth, General Kellogg said on Fox News a year ago, he's a contributor there, he said a year ago that he will evict, if it was him in charge, he would evict Putin from the Donbass and Crimea. So
that's pretty hawkish.
That's pretty hawkish. Well, it also ties into this larger thing that Ukraine's larger issues are manpower, and the White House is now pressing them to lower the conscription age, the draft age, to 18 years old. Obviously, they have not done that yet because they need the economy to go. But now they're saying you need to do it. Right now, Ukraine has 1 million soldiers. The White House thinks they need 150,000, but they think the number's probably higher. How many soldiers does Ukraine need? And if they're going to conduct an offensive, do they even have the men for this? I think mathematically it works out, but I think I'm missing something.
They're definitely short manpower. They've had some challenges with infantry in recent years, understandably so, right? That's the high attrition group in any military. We have seen them from the start of the war creep higher in allowing older people to serve, and they've really avoided. It wasn't up until very recently they moved the draft age down to 25 even. Which is kind of crazy here in the United States because we always think of like 18 to 25 being the war fighters. The war kicks off, it's somebody who's 19 or 20 thinks they're going, not I'm probably exempt. So it's very different than how we would do it. Ukraine does have a manpower problem. They do have it within their ability to improve that manpower problem, but it's just one piece of a larger puzzle. So again, we'll see a lot of people put all of the blame on that or all of the blame on weapons not arriving in time or not being given the green light to strike in certain areas. It's all a percentage of the overall issue. However, I think I was going to say the biggest, but it's not the biggest. A big part of this is the perception in the West. If they are saying they're fighting an existential war for their survival, it is very, very difficult to then square that with not mobilizing 18 to 25-year-olds.
Mm-hmm.
I understand
do
they
agree.
want to keep the economy going, but that's it. But you're talking to countries that did mobilize their 18 to 25-year-olds historically, so I think that's very, very hard to get across.
Why do you think they did it backwards? Because 18 to 25-year-olds, I understand they can work jobs, but middle-aged people have more money than 18 to 25-year-olds do. And they also have jobs, too.
Yeah, we should stress this is for mobilization. There are still a lot of Ukrainian citizens signing up to fight. So there are a lot of 18 to 25-year-olds that volunteered to go out and fight. So it's not as though the war is only being fought by people older. I think there's been a lot of political backlash in Ukraine, and it's just what I have heard is that has been very politically inconvenient, and they haven't wanted to go that route. And it took a lot of pressure for them to even reduce the age to 25. But I don't know. I mean, it's been pretty clear for quite a while now that this war is not going to be over soon. It's going to be a long war. It's going to be a very costly war, very attritional in nature. So, look, this might be one of the things people look back on in this war and say was a major mistake by Ukraine.
Do you think 60% of Ukrainian women said in April of 2022 that they were willing to fight in the conflict, sign up to be in the military, and then last year they revisited with another poll, and it found that generally speaking 80% of women in Ukraine are interested in helping the war effort, but only 30% of them are interested in a frontline combat duty. Do you think they will call upon women? Do you think they will begin to draft? I know that they are eligible for conscription, but right now it's only for combat medic.
They've had some luck with volunteer units in the northern part of the country. The Witches of Bucha. You heard of them?
Oh, that's their name?
Yeah, it's
Nice.
a drone unit, an anti-drone unit in Bucha, Ukraine, where I always feel like I'm mispronouncing that. It's Bucha or Bucha? It's Bucha, right?
I think it's... My guess is going to be Bucha, because Bucha sounds like kombucha, and that can't be right.
It's one of those where whenever I say it, I'm immediately convinced that I've been corrected in the other direction. So my apologies, because I probably got it wrong again. But anyways, they've got a group of all-female counter-drone units up there where the men are gone. They've been conscripted. They're off fighting the war. And there's still the occasional drone attack, so they've got women in uniform shooting down Russian drones. Far from the front, right? This is not in artillery range. The occasional missile might come through, but they are seeing drones. There's a lot of jobs in the military that are not at the front line. And the majority of jobs in the military are not at the front. So maybe that's another place they tap into. I mean, we're talking about logistics, communications, medical, fulfillment, supply. Like, there's just the vast majority of any military is not clearing trenches. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there, but it's a good point. Haven't seen if that's actually, I wonder if that's actually on the table.
Do you think there's been a lot of talk this year from the Baltic states, from Poland, about deploying Western troops to Western Ukraine to take over security there so that it frees up more manpower? How many men can realistically be deployed in the Western half for security? Would it make any impact on the front?
Yeah, I don't know how many troops Ukraine has over there. You also have to keep in mind that Ukraine does still have some troops on the northern border as well, with Belarus. We were talking about them earlier. Mm-hmm. It's not insignificant. And when you're talking about a nation in need of manpower at the front, that's a part of it. Now, again, to go back to will it make a difference, it's not as though Ukraine is like 100 soldiers away from being able to go on the offensive and retake the Donbass. One of the major problems they're having right now is Russia has a clear superiority in air power, in, for the most part, in ammunition, artillery available to artillery, missiles, rockets, and drones, and manpower. Additionally, as Russia advances, we're finding that Ukraine did not spend a lot of time digging secondary and tertiary defensive positions, So they're falling back to half-built lines and lines that just are not ready to repel a large Russian assault. Additional manpower kind of fixes that because you start digging lines maybe earlier, but there's a lot of issues right now contributing to why Russia is on the advance, and it's not purely manpower. So, how many could it free up? 10, 20, 30,000 maybe? I have to imagine, especially in the West, those areas aren't heavily, Ukraine's issues in the East and the South and a little bit in the North. So I can't imagine they've got very many forces in a defensive posture in the West.
Do you think, circling back to General Kellogg, when they talk about flooding the zone, what does that mean? What can the United States give Ukraine that can truly change the situation on the ground that they don't already have?
Okay. I think if you push the button and say right now it's go time, the first thing you would do is free up the ability for Ukraine to conduct strikes inside of Russian territory, take the handcuffs off. ATACMS is a short-range ballistic missile. We refer to ATACMS and Storm Shadow often as long-range strikes because it's the longest that Ukraine can strike inside of Russia with Western munitions. In the scope of how militaries view these things, ATACMS is a short-range ballistic missile. So anyways, take the handcuffs off there. They can strike more targets inside of Russia. I would expect to see a push of probably some of the equipment that they're already utilizing, maybe some more HIMARS launchers, probably a lot of HIMARS munition, a push of artillery ammunition, Bradleys probably, and similar fighting vehicles, electronic warfare equipment, and then air defense. But I think all of that would change the nature of the fight. I don't think that we're like one shipment away from Ukraine being able to retake Volodar. You send in enough air defense, enough new air defense equipment, which would come at a cost because it's not unlimited, that would help protect more of the Ukrainian skies. Then maybe you can send in additional F-16s because they got some of the pilots trained on that now, and that can help protect other areas of the front and maybe provide close air support for the troops in certain areas, probably more of a combat air patrol route to prevent Russian aircraft from coming into Ukrainian airspace. That might give some time for additional Bradleys and HIMARS or another type of IFV, APC, to push back in certain areas. So I think we could, in a sense, but that's a lot. And I think there'd be a lot of pushback in the U.S. to doing that because it wouldn't be like the surge wouldn't be 20 more Bradleys or 1,000 more rounds of ammunition. If we're talking about a surge, it would be a lot.
So there's not like a secret. We're just talking about quantity, basically. There's not a secret weapon that Ukraine needs that all of a sudden having it changes the ballgame. Maybe it's the F-35. That's not happening, though.
There you go. It's quantity. And even then you run into a bit of an issue. Like if we gave them unlimited HIMARS ammunition, the Mike 3-1 Gimlers, like they would use it, it would be effective, but they've only got so many launchers. So then you give them unlimited launchers, right, and unlimited HIMARS ammunition. Like there's, again, only so many targets those are going to be used against, whereas a Russian platoon of armored personnel carriers is still going to make an advance on the front. And HIMARS is not really effective at all in that case. So it's a lot. It's complicated.
It does seem complicated. So that, I mean, we're definitely entering a very interesting but scary moment in the war. I am more worried about the state of the war than I have been in previous years.
I think that's
previous
fair.
months.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Not because I don't. I don't fear nuclear war, but I fear that if the United States recedes from Europe, we're in a far bigger conflict than we'd want to be. I also think flooding the zone is very dangerous, but I also think continuing what we're doing is really dumb as well. They ask for weapons, we decline, and they decline, and then they ask again, and then 6 months later we give it to them. That's also really stupid. With Jake Sullivan and his imaginary escalation ladder. So I don't know. I think we're entering wouldn't want to be Ukrainian. Actually, I'd much rather not be Russian, but that's for sure.
There you go. So it's interesting because right now Russia is they have the upper hand in just about every aspect of this war. When you're looking at the battlefield, when you step back into economic and social, it gets much more complicated. But on the battlefield, Russia is making gains at a rather rapid pace, considering how this war is played out. And that is happening at a time when we are going. I'm certain we're going to see some sort of change in how the war is approached when Trump comes into office. I think it is still up for debate, and we'll have to wait and see which direction it goes. But that change, probably the biggest change in terms of U.S. support to Ukraine, is coming in 50 days at the same time that Russia is making rapid progress in the battlefield. So it's possibly culminating in one way or another.
I agree. Do you think, what is the worst case scenario and what is the best case scenario? It's January 21st right now. What is the worst case scenario for something that could happen and the best case scenario?
For who?
For Ukraine. For Ukraine, what is the best thing President Trump could do, and what is the worst thing, in your opinion, he could do in regards to the situation here?
Worst case would be walk away right away and make clear from day one that we're not going to send anything else, because that just, Putin has, we lose all leverage at that point. I think that is a card that we have to play. So walking away entirely, and I know there are groups in our politics right now that want to do that today. I think walking away day one entirely, no questions asked, would be the worst for Ukraine. The best would probably be some mix of what you talked about earlier. Honestly, the best for Ukraine is if there's NATO troops in country and NATO aircraft overhead.
That is true.
I don't think that's likely. I don't know that that's necessarily the best for NATO and for the United States, but for Ukraine, I think they would very much like to have F-35s assisting in Kursk and the 1st Armored Division assaulting into Crimea.
So let me ask you this. So, we talk about France and the UK. They talked about deploying troops, Poland's coalition, the willing, yada, 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 yada. What are the odds? I mean, the F-35 is so advanced. I mean, do they really need to even send troops? If they want to intervene directly in some way, do they even need to send troops? Can't they just... I think the European powers are perfectly capable of conducting a no-fly zone in Europe. My understanding is that Russia's air power is not that impressive. As we saw Israel striking Iran, the F-35 cannot be targeted by the S-400 and the S-300. Do you think that's a more likely scenario than troops on the ground?
Yeah, but I still put it in a very small likelihood. It's still troops entering a very hot combat zone, and even the most advanced aircraft still can be shot down, still be intercepted. It can still have malfunctions and cost lives. So I think slightly more I think it's more likely than NATO troops on the ground, but I think we're still a long ways away from any of that.
Absolutely true. Well, speaking of NATO troops on the ground, these drones are flying over. So as you know, there are drones harassing U.S. Bases in the United States. They fly over the drones. They thought it was a Chinese national, but they could find no evidence to convict him of such. Now in the UK, in 3 different locations, the U.S. leases bases from the Royal Air Force. We have drones flying over the bases, and investigators say it is not hobbyists, and they believe it has to be Russian or Chinese or Iranian. So they deployed 60 British troops there, and I believe the official British statement, they said, it's a bit odd, isn't it? Okay, that I'm not kidding. That is what one of the anonymous defense officials said. And then they also said it could be a bunch of fuckwits, or it could be something more sinister. So it's probably the most British response I've ever heard of for my life.
Perfect.
But something's happening here, right? And so these drones keep harassing. So my question to you is, what's going on here? I mean, they're deep in the UK. They're deep in the United States. Are these different groups? Or is this Havana syndrome all over again?
So at baseline, something I think worth mentioning is the troops that they would have sent would have been some degree of electronic warfare, air defense, something like that. So I would not expect that they put 60 infantrymen with machine guns on the ground. That's probably not what they meant when they said troops.
Yes.
But not that you were implying that, but I think that somebody might read that and say, what's a platoon of infantry going to do against these drones?
It's just you and your buddies out there. Yeah.
Hanging out, man. More targets.
Yeah.
So a couple thoughts there. One is I think somebody could be testing the defenses in these areas, and as robust as the anti-drone defenses are downrange in hostile environments, they're nowhere near as robust stateside or in friendly territory, just because it doesn't have to be. That threat's not there.
Right.
And the means that we go about to defend against drones, shutting down radio frequencies, and there's a lot that goes into it. It's not something easily done in the middle of England or in the middle of the United States. So, it's not crazy that somebody would test it out and see, like, how close can drones get? How can they get directly over the base, and what size drones and things like that. I have, when I came back from Afghanistan in 2011 and then in 12, I was convinced that we were going to start seeing IEDs on the streets, like everywhere, because
in the United States or in Afghanistan?
In the United States. Because in Afghanistan, they were making it out of fertilizer in a blasting cap. I was like, well, this is so easy to make. And like anybody who's been in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria would say the same thing. Like, you get nervous when you see trash on the side of the road because the trash could cover up an IED. And it's like, well, bring that back home. We drive by trash on the road all the time. Like, it would be so easy. We're not looking for it, and these bombs are easy to build, and we haven't seen that. That threat hasn't really materialized in the United States, which is crazy because it's so easy. I feel that same way about drones right now. It would be so easy for a hobbyist with drones to look at a handful of videos, now coming out of Syria, but certainly coming out of Ukraine and Russia, figure out how to build something that can cause some damage, and do a lot of harm with it. We're talking about military bases in this case, but there's a lot of destruction that could be had with just a hobbyist and a drone. So I know a lot of people are looking into it, but I feel like we're not there, not even close, in terms of effective drone defense right now.
My question is how they can't seem to find out who's responsible for this. I feel like all the time you see a news story about someone pointing a laser pointer at an airplane, and then they're like arrested 30 minutes later. How is it that these drones are flying over U.S. bases, and it's just they're somehow incapable of finding out where these things are coming from?
Maybe they weren't set up to do that, right? Like, I'm sure if you flew a drone over the White House, they would probably have everything in place to be able to say, here's the frequency and here's where it was coming from. But I wonder if every single airbase maybe doesn't have that capability set up right now. Again, it's not something that we've had to deal with.
Right.
My guess is in Ukraine, they've got that stuff set up. In Russia, they've probably got that set up, but I wouldn't write that off entirely. We haven't maybe deployed those countermeasures everywhere quite yet.
I've seen some suggestion online. I think it's perhaps a little dumb, but maybe it's right, that they keep causing these news stories that, we don't know where the drones are coming from, to try to lure more people into doing the drone stuff, or learn.
And then we can see the bad guys.
Yeah, do you think that's a really dumb strategy, or do you think that's legitimate?
No, I don't know.
Because to me, if I saw a news story, it's like, man, we really can't stop people from robbing banks. My reaction wouldn't be to go rob more banks. I'd be like, it's a total setup. So, I mean, do you think it is a setup here, or do you think this is just democracy at work? Yeah.
I don't know. I probably wouldn't go that route, because if you start to see, so I'll use your bank analogy, if there's news stories coming out saying we can't stop anybody from robbing banks, part of my thinking is they're probably going to start putting more effort into stopping people from robbing banks. Right. They're focused on it now. So I don't know. I would probably say we don't know how many of these. When you're talking about a drone flying over some of these locations, you have to wonder what they're gathering. And it's probably not like updated satellite imagery. It's probably about how close can we get drones to these things before they're detected. But we'll see. It's kind of crazy. And also not shocking at all, right? Of course it's happening. Right?
Yeah. Yes. Well, speaking of misinformation,
yes,
well, not speaking of. I mean, we had truth information there, but so this new study from the United Nations found that 62% of influencers share information without verifying if it's real. Does that sound right to you? Does that sound right to you? Yeah, go ahead. Go.
I don't know. So my pushback here is this is an article published on CNN. CNN is one of the traditional media outlets that is hurting
fake news.
It's hurting with the rise of online news influencers, if you will. Mm-hmm. Right? Like people are taking their readership, their viewership away. So there's an incentive for CNN in this case to be like, look at this. The people you're getting your news from are making up their stories. But if you read into this a little bit more, I think it was a misleading headline. I think it was borderline misinformation, Ben.
Really?
Really, because they said they included a content creator or influencer with somebody with over 1,000 followers. Ben, I don't know that somebody with 1,000 followers would be considered a big-time news influencer. I think that's too low a bar.
I agree with well.
And let me keep going before you defend.
Okay, you're right. You're basically just posting to your friends at that point. Yeah.
Only 12% of the people that they interviewed produce content about current affairs, politics, and the economy. So what are the other 80? The other 88% are talking about what? Like family life and sports and jokes. Like, so they're not. What are they checking? Like, I don't really care too much if the joke is fact-checked.
That is a fair point. Yeah.
So like, very few were about news and politics. They were small accounts. I think they were looking for something bad to say about us content creators.
Really? So it's good that you looked further into it, because my reaction was, yeah, I entirely believe that 62% of content creators do not verify the information before they share it. I mean, we've seen that with our peers on TikTok and YouTube and in the Twitter sphere, or the X sphere. But yeah, these are pretty valid points.
The other way I would argue that is if somebody is continually not checking their sources and putting out bad information, they're probably not going to grow very much. I mean, some will. Like, just there's some accounts out there that are just wild in their misinformation.
Would you like to name some?
I try to call some out on X from time to time, or it's just over the top. But and I don't mean like a difference of opinion.
Yes.
I mean like straight up taking a picture from Fallujah, Iraq in 2004 and say American troops were just killed in Gaza, right? Like just blatantly made up stuff.
Or, repeating the Daily Mail word for word. That's also a thing. I've seen some creators do, so I don't know. The other piece here was they said they're not checking their sources, but I do think there's some confusion in what is CNN looking for in that case, or the UN in this case. So they said while 1 in 5 said 4 in 10 influencers evaluated a source's credibility by popularity. Number of likes and views. I 100% can see how that happens, and that's crazy, and that's not good. But they said 1 in 5 trusted friends and experts were the most common factor in determining an online source's credibility. I think there's something to that. What does that mean? Why is that one category, friends and experts?
Okay, so I have a question about a recent Department of State pick. I call Ben, and Ben, what happened? I trust you. I know that you're read up on this stuff, so I'm not fact-checking the information you told me.
That's
you are
fair.
my fact.
Okay, so friend and expert. I guess to me, I kind of took it the wrong way. I kind of took it as, yeah, I asked my friend, he says true, or I asked my brother's friend, who believes the Mayan calendar, and he was like, yeah,
because that's the opposite of helpful.
Right. So I was like, friends and experts. What does that mean? My friends are so dumb. They don't know anything. So
interesting. Because the way I went with that was if Michael Kaufman, a Russia analyst, says the Russian army just increased death payments to X, I might go look that up. But the dude's really trustworthy, and he's put out a lot of really solid information so far. So I probably would, if it's not something crazy and it's coming from somebody who has put out a lot of really good quality information. I don't have time in my day. Most people don't have time in their day to every single thing they hear be like, I need to go fact check that 6 ways to Sunday before putting it out. There's got to be that bullshit censor, right?
Oh, I fully agree. There should be a bullshit censor. There was another part of this article that said roughly 6 in 10 influencers deferred to their own personal experiences as a source of information or to determine if something was true. That's kind of That's crazy. Like, what do you mean your personal experience lets you know something's true?
Okay, I'll push back on that.
Okay.
Something in the
hear it.
Army. You'll hear something like, John McIntyre. You remember this dude? Name ring a bell? Foreign Legion, Ukraine, defected to Russia because he wanted to fight communism or something. I can't remember.
Yes.
The dude said he was like in the command room overseeing CIA-run operations with the Ukrainian military, which sounds crazy, right? But when you look into the guy's background and his role in Ukraine, you're like, that dude is a private. And he is manning a security position. He is nowhere near senior leaders planning operations with, undercover CIA operatives in some back room in Ukraine. So my experience in the military knows that looking at him and the rest of his story doesn't add up with other parts.
So, okay, I can see it from that point of view. But I also think it goes back to the friends and expert things where, not everyone's Ben Wheeler or Preston Stewart,
And sometimes, I've got friends in the military that'll verify things that are wildly untrue.
Right. So if you told me, I'm inclined to believe, I understand your point that perhaps it's a hit job by CNN, the UN, I could see that. But given everything that happened with Israel and Palestine, everything that's happened with Ukraine and Russia, in even our own election, I'm inclined to believe that of these 500 digital creators, I think, I'd fully believe that 6 in 10.
You're more pessimistic on this, yeah.
Well, I just feel like I see some of the things that get tagged in. I'm just like, who are these people? How do you believe that? How do you uncritically look at this? How do you believe this? And you've been posting for 2 years now about this. So naturally, I feel like we all have I think it's early on, if you make a mistake, it's whatever. But once you're in this for 2-3 years, we're all watching the same war. How do you not have a bullshit detector, right? How are you still reciting the same Russia Today articles that you were in the beginning? So, I'm pretty pessimistic about this. I've even seen big creators just report flat out disinformation, and I'm like, what is happening here?
Well, it's part of a bumpy ride, a bumpy transition. I don't think we have it figured out yet. But that's part of a Pew Research even hit on this. Recently, was an article I sent over where they did it. So Pew, pretty legit research organization here, 20% of Americans and 30% of those and 40% of those under 30 get their news from influencers and social media. That's wild, dude. It's not like it's a big number, but I think we're watching this play out. More and more viewers coming to channels talking about current events and people turning away from traditional media. I just thought that played in well with hopefully they're going to folks that are at least somewhat fact checking what they're looking at.
You hope, right? I guess I kind of feel I understand it's going this way and I'm part of it. We're part of it, right? But to me, I don't know. I kind of feel like there have to be gatekeepers still. That I think the New York Times of the world, the CNNs, the Fox News, the news part of Fox News, the news part of MSNBC, I think that they serve critical roles, and I think that their readership and viewership should be higher, because these people have reputations and $1 million contracts on the line if they mess up, whereas influencers, it's like, if I'm wrong today, it doesn't actually matter tomorrow, because not everyone will see it and people will forget. So, and I think, I will say this, the one thing the news industry has going for it is that there's nothing the news industry loves doing more than talking about itself and prosecuting itself. So when one outlet reports something wrong, all the other outlets jump on them. Influencers don't really have that. We're hesitant to just even name names because we don't want to get into it, right? That's where I feel with the news industry, they are much more willing to talk about themselves, prosecute themselves, and come up with a solution. Thoughts?
I don't know. There's a lot there. There's pros and cons in both directions. Yeah, I don't know. I like this. I like that people can come to. So, like, one of the things I like is we'll use traditional media. If you're trying to understand, like, the nuance of what's going on in Syria right now and you tune into CNN or Fox, like, you're not going to get it. It's just not there. They cannot get to that level. Maybe they'll have a talking head on for 3 minutes or something, and it's still confusing.
Yeah. But
if somebody's really interested in that, they can go download Generation Jihad, the podcast, and listen to guys who have focused on the war in Syria for the last, forever, right? They're
Right.
intertwined into that stuff because you can get into that expert. And, like, yeah, there's not a gatekeeper there, but, like, you can seek out those experts if you want, and that expert has a voice in something like this that I think is really important. So they could get something wrong, but I don't know, man. The traditional outlets get stuff wrong all the time. Or
that is true.
I don't know. I don't like talking about media as much, though. This is kind of funny, but
yeah, you're not. I don't think you're a true newsman. You don't like nothing. News people love doing more than talking about the news. No, I'm just playing. So, do we have any other news here? I mean, Kim Jong-un said he's not interested in talking to Donald Trump, which is another saga in the Kim saga, whatever that's about. Any thoughts there?
Not really. I've been pretty hyper-focused on Syria and Ukraine and then Hezbollah. So it's been chaotic last couple days. And now I guess...
Agreed.
It's going to continue, right?
Any progress on a logo? Any submissions?
No. I also didn't put a link in the last show notes like I said I was going to. So you want to put my email in there maybe? People can email me if they want to try to put something.
Oh, you want the... I was thinking just put your handle and they could tweet it at you or something. But you want to email you?
Yeah, or DM.
Okay.
We'll figure it out. One of those, yeah.
Yeah, we need a logo.
It's my wedding anniversary, so we're going to Nashville tonight.
Oh, it is. Wow, happy anniversary. How many years?
10 years.
Wow, 10 years? Yeah. That's a long time.
That's a long time. We made it. Big time.
Where'd you guys get married at?
Where?
Yeah.
Champaign.
Or you're going to tell me where. How'd you meet? Oh, Champaign. Shout out to the Fighting Illini. How'd you guys meet?
There we go. I don't know. Blind date.
Wow. Set up by a friend?
Friend of mine.
Or are you just...
Yeah. Mutual friend. So a couple that I went to high school with were at Kentucky. They got married after high school, and Megan was in medical school with the girl, and I had just gotten back from Afghanistan, and my buddy said, come visit, because I was at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. He said, come visit on your first weekend. I got a blind date for you. So, worked well.
Did you wear your dress blues to the date?
Nope.
Did you say...
I don't like wearing my
Did you say you can thank me for my service now? Did you ask that of her? No?
Of course. I lead with that anywhere I go. Still for today. So, yeah.
Yes, I see. But it was love at first sight then, clearly. I mean, it worked out.
Yeah. It's good. 10 years going strong.
Well, good for you. We love to see it. Shout out to Preston for his 10-year wedding anniversary. But more important news, we're the #1 national security podcast in the world, at least on YouTube. On YouTube, solely focused on national security. Don't save the words. Yeah, don't say the words "pod save the world" to me, because I think that is a geopolitical podcast and not a national security podcast. So, so here we are. We're bigger than ever, and so subscribe to be part of that. Like it, comment. The comments do help. Subscribe on Spotify. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts. Follow Preston and I everywhere. Our handles will be in the description. And, I mean, let us know what you think. If there are any topics you want us to cover, let us know. And, of course, if you have a logo, if you're gifted artistically, send it through, because we are lost here, folks. We are truly lost. Preston, anything to say before we let our folks go?
No, appreciate the support. Ben, thanks for running through this today, man. Good to chat as always.
Of course, I hope everyone listening had a happy Thanksgiving, or if you're not American, I hope your Thursday was fine. If you're Russian, I hope you had a very terrible Thursday. No, that's... If you're on the front... I mean, they're not listening on the front lines. I retract this statement. That was rude of me. Anyways, have a good night, everybody. And, it is over.